Welcome, everyone. Good evening. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm the founder of the Parent Education Series and proud co-founder of our new nonprofit organization, the Parent Venture. We are so excited that you could join us tonight for a very important and timely conversation on fostering creativity and innovation in uncertain times. When we named this webinar, we didn't know quite how uncertain the week would be, but I do think it's a timely conversation. So again, a special thanks to tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Steve Smith. Steve is a longtime favorite of the Parent Education Series. We have offered presentations in the past in his areas of expertise, including athletics and boys and men. So tonight we're going to be talking about creativity, and I'll explain to you a little bit more about why that is. But some of you may remember we showed several years ago the film The Mask You Live In, and then we actually had a follow-up group with parents of boys that Steve moderated in his role as a clinical psychologist, and that was a lot of fun. So there may be some elements of that Steve will touch on tonight. As always, I want to say a big thank you to our sponsors, the Sequoia Union High School District, the Sequoia Healthcare District, and in particular tonight, the Woodside PTSA. We're very grateful for your sponsorship. This program would not be possible without it. So the format tonight is going to go like this. Steve is going to talk to us for about 30 minutes, and then I will join him, and we will have some questions. We would love to have questions from you, the audience. Most of you are probably familiar with Zoom by now if you have kids in school. But if not, you will notice at the bottom, if you run your finger along the bottom of the Zoom screen, there is a chat box. My partner, Bev Hartman, is going to be putting links and relevant information in that chat box, including a very short survey link at the end of the evening. But we would like you to put your questions, if you could, in the Q&A box. Also, very importantly, if you need Spanish interpretation tonight, we are offering simultaneous Spanish interpretation with Cynthia Hinojosa. If you need Spanish, click on the globe icon that says interpretation, and then click on the Spanish globe, okay? So Spanish interpretation, the Spanish globe, if you need it. All right, well, let me see. I think it's time for me to tell you a little bit about our presenter. Oh, I will also mention that tonight's presentation will be video recorded and appear in a few days on our video library. We're proud to say we've had over 11,000 views of videos on this library YouTube channel, including 4,000 since COVID-19. So we are grateful to you, the parents, caregivers who are joining us tonight, and we hope you will make use of these free resources. Okay, here we go. Dr. Steve Smith is a teaching professor and chair of the Department of Counseling, Clinical, and School Psychology at UC Santa Barbara. He's the director of UCSB's Hosford Counseling and Psychological Services Clinic, and he teaches in the College of Creative Studies at UCSB. He is also the consulting psychologist to Santa Barbara Middle School, and he has a private clinical psychology practice in Santa Barbara, where he predominantly works with men and boys. Dr. Smith was trained as a clinical child psychologist at the University of Arkansas before completing an internship and fellowship in child and adult psychology at Massachusetts General Hospital and the Harvard Medical School. He served as director of consultation neuropsychology at Mass General before joining the faculty of UC Santa Barbara in 2004. Steve is a lifelong athlete and competitive runner. He lived in the Bay Area from 2004 to 2016, where he directed the PsyD program at the University of Palo Alto before returning to UC Santa Barbara. Steve is the proud father of 2 young children, athletes in the making. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you so much, Charlene. I am so pleased to talk with all of you tonight. And I'm pleased that we can all take a break from hitting refresh on the New York Times website to find out what the election results are of the moment. I'm always really excited to talk about creativity. I teach in the College of Creative Studies at UC Santa Barbara, which is the College of Creative Studies is this weird little independent unit in the UC Santa Barbara system where really bright undergraduates who are very motivated and very smart and a little weird come to take on high-level work right out of the box. So students can come in and study physics and chemistry and biology and art and literature and all these things. And then often by the time that they are third and fourth year students, they're taking graduate level courses. And so it's this odd little unit on campus. We call it the Graduate School for Undergraduates. And in the College of Creative Studies, I teach like weird classes for them. I teach a class on epistemology. I teach a class on sleep. I teach a class on spaces and environments. But the class that I love teaching the most is a class called Creativity Studies. And believe it or not, there's a whole subsection of psychology and sociology that deals with understanding creativity. Creativity in adults, creativity in children, creativity in art and science. And so what I want to do tonight is talk a little bit about what we mean by creativity, what's involved with thinking of creativity or making creative acts, and then talking about how we can foster this in children, and particularly now in the times that we find ourselves living in. Hopefully you can all see my presentation. So, when we talk about creativity, one of the things that we find is that in the field, there's not a really good definition for what it means to be creative. Definitions generally involve saying that something is original, surprising, and appropriate. Original, surprising, and appropriate way to solve a problem. Okay, there's often a problem-solving component to what we mean by creativity. Other definitions of creativity include that it must involve some type of personal expression, that it must be aesthetically pleasing in some way, or that it's even reflective of a system of values. There's some debate about whether or not all art is creative. There's some art that seems like that's really creative art. And then there's things like Thomas Kincaid, maybe less creative. But in any case, there's generally a sense that creativity involves a way of solving a problem in a way that is unique, surprising, thinking outside the box, that kind of thing. And sometimes the problem to be solved is the artist's own expression of some type of feeling or a statement. So when we have those kinds of ideas in mind about what does it mean to be creative? Well, we're trying to solve problems in a way that are unique, or trying to express something unique about our experience. And so the first thing that we want to try to understand is like, well, what do people need to be creative? What are kinds of things that we think of when we think of creative people? Well, first of all, do creative people need to be smart? Well, the answer seems to be probably not. Now, certainly for big creative acts in science and physics and math or something like that, yeah, you probably need to be pretty sharp. But on the whole, there's not much relationship between things like measured IQ scores and creativity. Do creative people need to be good at school? Absolutely not. The research is super clear about this, that achievement test scores and things like SATs, these things don't predict creativity at all. So if you give people measures of school achievement and that kind of thing, their measures of creativity are generally unrelated. And so what are the attributes that people seem to have, creative people seem to have? Well, they seem to be very flexible in their thinking. They're okay with risk-taking. They're open to new experiences. They're somewhat impervious to the thoughts of others, which is why people who are somewhere along the autism spectrum often are very creative, because they don't care so much about what people think. Creative people challenge themselves to broaden their skill sets or to expose themselves to new ideas or new ways of being in the world. Many creative people tend to have experienced some form of adversity, so some type of setback that has given them a shift in perspective about things around them. Much to the chagrin of my students, middle-aged people tend to be really creative, just because you've acquired some degree of skill and some type of knowledge that allows you to shift your thinking about things and look at them differently. Creative people tend not to be the most conscientious people, right? So that whole stereotype of sort of the weird creative person who has a messy office, there's some truth to that, okay? But generally speaking, we think of people who are somewhat iconoclastic, very flexible in their thinking, open to taking risks, not super concerned about what other people think about. Now, what is the process of being creative? Now, this has been studied in a lot of different ways. And so, um, and there's lots of different models for what it means to be creative or to engage in a creative process. And this is something that we can all do, and also something that we tend to do intuitively anyway. And there are four basic steps in creating something. One is to identify the problem. You have to be really clear about what is the problem that you're trying to solve. The second one is the incubation, meaning you just don't do anything about that for a while. Like, okay, I've identified that there's a problem that I'm going to solve. I'm just going to sit on that for a little bit and just let my mind wander, sort of think about things a little bit. And then the execution, the third step, boom, I'm going to do something. I'm going to invent something, make something, write something, try to solve a problem in a new way, write a formula, whatever the mode is that we're working on. We execute, we try to solve the problem. And then finally, we evaluate it and see how well it goes. Now, the important one of these four steps is the incubation period. And this is often the thing that a lot of people neglect to do. And if all the interviews with like creative artists and people who have been innovative in tech and science and all these other things, a lot of times they have time. They have time before they do anything. And in all theories of creativity, there's a lot of time involved in order to come up with creative products. You know, sometimes my students hate this, but sometimes when I read a draft of a paper or of something that they've written, I say, you need to delete that and don't work on it for 2 weeks and start over. They hate that. But it's the incubation period that's really essential, that we have to allow things to percolate. And then sometimes the ideas emerge fully formed. Okay, so the question is, well, how do we foster creativity? How do we help people become more creative, or really not even become more creative, but sort of remove the barriers to creativity? Because I think everybody is inherently creative. Well, things that really seem to foster creativity are travel. Can't do so much of that right now, but generally speaking, travel and exposure to other cultures, other ways of being in the world, makes people more creative, look at things differently. Real exposure to diversity, so interacting with people who are different from us, helps us look at things differently. Like I mentioned before, time. Time is a big one. It's really important to have time. Time helps foster creativity. Lack of consequences for failure. In the College of Creative Studies, where I teach at UCSB, there are no grades. A student who does better, they get more units. A student who does worse, they get fewer units. But there's no grades, because we want to encourage students to play and to be creative and to take risks. Grades and things like that work against that sort of thing. Another thing that helps foster creativity is play, unstructured play. One of the best days in my creativity studies class is the day that I bring in the Legos. And all the students know that there's going to be a Legos day, where I take the Legos and I just dump them out on the table and I watch 18 to 22-year-olds play like children. And then we do some creative work after that, and they talk about how important it is. And so for children, that's essential, that unstructured playtime, not video games, not team sport practice or that sort of thing, but just play, imaginative play. Another thing that helps foster creativity is time in nature. Research is really clear that getting outside, being around trees, being in natural settings helps us feel more creative. There's actually been some really nice almost like controlled clinical trials of being outside as improving scores on creativity measures. And finally, another thing that we need in order to be creative is an environment that fosters that and that really supports us for doing all of these things, supporting us in our play, supporting us in taking risks, supporting us in being who we are. And so For many of you, here's this question when you think about your own children. It's like, well, how do schools fit into this? How do schools relate to creativity? Well, research is actually pretty clear that a lot of schools tend to reduce creativity. And if you had to think of a structure that would reduce a child's creativity, often a school is a pretty good place to do that. Many schools, certainly not all. So by having things like time limits, and so time limits for in-work assignments and things like that reduces creativity. Social comparison and competition. A lot of schools either implicitly or explicitly have a lot of social comparison and competition, along with a public evaluation, knowing who the smart kids are, the kids who do the best work and that kind of thing. That tends to reduce someone's creativity because you can think about what that does for things like risk taking or thinking outside the box. It's one of these other, you hear a lot about brainstorming. And here, as someone who teaches a class on creativity, I can tell you, you should always avoid brainstorming. Research is clear that brainstorming generally leads to worse outcomes than people thinking by themselves because there's that public evaluation. Well, someone's not going to think this is a good idea, or I'm going to say a thing and they're going to think it's dumb. Well, that's exactly what creative ideas are. They are the things that a lot of times people think are kind of dumb. And so by having that public evaluation in schools tends to reduce some creativity. Schools tend to reward routine behavior rather than interesting behavior. Sit up straight, walk in a straight line, do these kinds of things. Those are routine behaviors that we reward children for, and they need to know how to do that. But unless we also reward interesting behavior or thinking differently kind of behavior, then creativity is a bit stifled. Schools tend to focus a lot on grades and performance, so that focusing on performance and outcome rather than process is a thing that also inhibits creativity. And finally, again, the notion of not allowing children time to play. Research has shown that children's playtime across the board is dropped by a quarter or a third in the past 20 years. Children just don't play anymore. They're structured. And it's that unstructured playtime that really gives birth to a lot of really good creative products. So, as a graduate school professor, one of my jobs is that I'm tasked every year with picking doctoral students for our PhD program. And we're a mentorship model program here at UCSB. So I have full discretion over the students that I pick. And I generally, when I'm doing a lot of research, which I tend not to do anymore, but when I was doing a lot of research, I would pick like one student a year. And our department, we get about 400 applications for 10 spots. And in choosing my one student per year, I began to make some choices after I noticed the students and how I picked them and sort of how they did in their studies. And at a certain point in my career, I stopped taking students who had attended large research universities. I stopped taking students who had gone to places like UCSB, quite ironically. Those students were smart, they were accomplished, they were very driven. Often they had perfect test scores and perfect GRE scores. Many of them had perfect grades in high school too, along with tutors and pitching coaches and violin teachers and all of those kinds of things. And I found that many of them were really good doers, but not the best thinkers. Meaning that I could tell them what to do and they would do an amazing job of it, like a perfect job of the thing that I would ask them to do. But they hadn't fostered their ability to think outside the box or to go beyond what I had asked them to do, or even to do something different than I asked them to do because their idea was better than my idea. I began to notice that there's sometimes a little bit less groomed student who had maybe gone to a liberal arts college or was the first in their family to attend college often had a much brighter creative spark. They were often Also a lot less burned out. They're often less burned out from a lifetime of an achievement and performance orientation. Sometimes these students were a little bit less polished, but what they brought to the team and really to my field of psychology was immeasurable. And often sometimes I will say to the students, or I used to say this, I don't anymore, but I used to say, when you ever have that experience when a professor tells you to write a paper or to do a project, and you're like, well, I understand what they want me to do, but I'm going to do something a little bit different than that. And maybe I'll get an A, or maybe I'll fail. Who knows? And I remember saying that to some students a few years back, and they just stared at me like I had two heads. They had no idea what I was talking about. The whole notion of taking those kinds of academic risks was completely foreign to their experience because they were students who were trained to get good grades, not to think and to indulge in their education or to experiment and to play. Which brings me to my point. That being a stressed out overdoer is antithetical to creativity. And we're raising a generation of students who are very good doers, but maybe not the best creative thinkers. And more than that, we're raising a generation of stressed out overdoers who don't have time to think and to orient, and they tend to be more oriented to outcomes rather than process. And we know that kids are stressed. Over a third of kids, let me just let this sink in, but over a third of kids will have a diagnosable anxiety disorder by the time that they're 18. The median age at which a child is diagnosed with anxiety is 6 years old. And more than 2/3 of teenagers report that school is a source of substantial stress, greater than bullying or parent problems or anything like that, the academic aspects of school. A quarter of teenagers report not eating because they don't have enough time. Depression in teenagers has risen by 70% since 2013. That's not even very long. There's been an increase in teen suicide, as certainly those of you in the Bay Area have seen very painfully. Lots of kids are using a lot more drugs, a lot more hard drugs, a lot more prescription drugs that are not prescribed to them in recent years. And it's true that teenagers are really suffering like they haven't been before. So why is this happening? So I talk about these three mythologies. I talk about the three mythologies of the good college, good job, good life. And often when I sit with kids in my practice, I say, well, what do you want? I say, well, I want to work really hard in school because I want to go to a good college so I can get a good job, have a good life. Like they say this all the time. And I call these my three mythologies because things are like way more complex than this, of course. So looking first at what does it mean to be a good college? Well, I would argue that the best college is the one that fits your kid. Overall, college admissions are not more competitive than they were 15 years ago. It's true that colleges get more applications than they used to because of the Common App. But overall rates of admission to colleges haven't changed. In fact, most colleges are just admitting more students. Here at UCSB, yes, getting a lot more applications, but we're also increasing the size of the student body by several thousand students. And although the very top colleges may be harder to get into than they were 15, 20 years ago, more and more students are being admitted to college. And ironically, a lot of really good colleges are struggling. The small private liberal arts colleges, for which I have a very strong fondness, these colleges are really hurting for admissions, and some of them are even going out of business. Our culture seems to think that the STEM jobs are the STEM careers are the only places where there are jobs. But the research is actually pretty clear. There was a whole thing in the New York Times about this not so long ago, that liberal arts majors eventually make as much money as students who majored in STEM. So, God bless the philosophy students and the English students. because eventually they're going to make as much money, statistically speaking, as the students who are majoring in computer science. We also know that college selectivity doesn't make for a better life. There is a small relationship between the selectiveness of a college and financial benefit, but it's mostly for non-majority kids and first-generation college students. The characteristics of the student, their determination, their work ethic, and those kinds of things matter a lot more than the college they go to. I've always said there's more variance in student than there is in college. So to be clear, for most of you, your child will not be happier in their jobs, wealthier, or even have a better educational experience than if they go to Stanford versus if they go to Cal State Dominguez Hills. And you have to remember that the selectiveness of a college is based mostly on the reputation, and the reputation of a college a lot of times has to do with research that the faculty does and the amount of grants that they get, and things that have nothing to do with the experience of an undergraduate student. I can tell you, as a faculty member at a Research One university, a lot of my faculty colleagues are trying to write grants so that they don't have to teach. Famous research professors are often really crappy teachers if they teach any classes at all. So what does it mean to get into a good college? Well, from my perspective, a good college is one where a kid can be free to experiment, where they can spread their wings, where they don't have to worry about failure so much, where they can be creative and feel engaged with the college in a way that allows them to feel supported. That's a good college. So what's a good job? Well, normally when a kid comes to me and they say, I want to get a good job, I say, well, what do you mean when you say that? And they say, I want one that makes a lot of money. Nearly every kid I ask, they say that. And they don't even mean just like a lot of little money, but they mean like a lot of money. They talk about money, and they want to have cars and houses and all these other kinds of things. And that focus on outcome is so different than what we saw 20 or 30 years ago. Even when I started seeing kids for therapy in graduate school in the 1990s, kids didn't talk about wanting to be rich so much. In prior generations, and researchers supported this, in prior generations, kids talked more about getting a good education, finding meaningful work, doing good things for society. But now the focus has shifted to be more about outcomes. And why shouldn't it? They're just doing what they're taught. They're taught to make the best grades, to be the best athlete, to get the best scores, to do the most curriculars. Those are outcome-based value systems. And my guess is that many of you have jobs that pay you very well. But maybe some of those high-paying jobs don't give you a sense of fulfillment or a sense of purpose. And a feeling of purpose and a feeling of fulfillment is inoculates us to all sorts of mental health issues. And I'm sure that all of us, some of the time, really feel unfulfilled and dissatisfied in our jobs. But a lot of people feel unfulfilled and unsatisfied, despite the fact that they're making a lot of money. And maybe you don't get to feel creative, or get to feel supported, or get to feel that your individuality is being expressed. Research is really clear that money doesn't buy happiness. I mean, it's a cliche that we have, and it's a cliche for a reason, because it's true. And research is really, really clear that happiness and income are correlated up to about $80,000 a year. Right? I mean, like the data on that are super clear. Happiness and money are correlated up to about $80,000 a year. And granted, that's more money than most people make in America. But above that, there's no relationship between finances and happiness. And so children have this weight on their shoulder of needing to make a lot of money, despite the fact that money is not going to bring the thing that they say that they want. I've worked with some really miserable billionaires. And sure, maybe there's some reduction in anxiety about money, where you don't have to worry about money. But that's not happiness. And that's certainly not fulfillment. So what do we talk about, or what do we think about when we talk about a good life? Well, my patients say, you know what, I want to be happy. I say, you don't get to have that. Not all the time. I want you to have periods of happiness. But no matter what, you're going to suffer, and that's okay. That's part of being a human being. What we want is fulfillment. What we want is a sense of purpose, a sense of purpose. We don't, not money, not happiness, but fulfillment. Good relationships, a sense of purpose, being at some degree of peace in the world. None of those things are related to money. Those are process things. Those are values. They're not outcomes. And then there's COVID. That's my daughter. Completely unposed photo. We were walking down the street. She decided to have a little temper tantrum in front of Zoom. I said, you are capturing a moment in my life, young lady. So when COVID came along, those of us in clinical practice, we saw a lot of anxiety in kids. They were amplifying the anxiety of their parents and the schools and everybody else around them. Everybody was anxious. But that has settled into a really deep sense of sadness and depression that I'm seeing much more often in teenagers. You know, here in Santa Barbara, our schools are starting to open, but they're cohorted and they're sort of unnatural, and kids have to wear masks and they can't connect with their friends in a way that is so important to their development. Kids without means have fallen further and further behind because either they don't have the equipment, they don't have the space, they don't have the privacy, or maybe they don't even have the safety. And in some ways, schools have had to become even more outcome oriented because it's hard to have decent processes on Zoom. Breakout rooms just don't cut it. You know, but at the same time, I'm noticing that kids are starting to talk more about processes. And so maybe there will be a silver lining on this. The kids talk more about, you know what, I really miss my time with friends. And I didn't know how important that was. Families are being reconnected in a way that just wasn't possible before. Sometimes better and sometimes worse. I hear kids talking more about social justice issues and thinking about the kids who don't have access to resources. I hear kids talking a lot about politics, especially this week. And I hear kids talking more and more about a future that is value-oriented rather than process-oriented, or value-oriented rather than outcome-oriented. The way that our country has mishandled COVID is a real reminder to focus on what's important. The time in lockdown, I think, has been clarifying for a lot of kids who are now confused about where to go and how to orient themselves to school. And for a lot of kids, I've heard some amazingly creative stories because they just simply had more time and they were more bored. So what do we want? We want to raise creative kids. I think that's something we can all get behind. But in order to raise creative kids, we need to focus on processes and values rather than outcomes. Kids need time to play. Research is so clear that play is an essential component to creativity. They need to be able to fail. We need to stop focusing so much on achievement and performance and amplifying the myth of good college, good job, good life. Let your kids be bored. If necessity is the mother of invention, boredom is the mother of creativity. Poet, philosopher, artist George Carlin once said, even the simple act of playing has been taken away from children and put on a schedule in the form of play dates. When does a kid ever just get to sit in the yard with a stick anymore? Children need to be bored in order to be creative. And finally, we need to focus on the values of giving to others, values of work-life balance, values of education rather than grades, value of a life of meaning and experience rather than money, and hollow versions of success. The greatest act of creativity is the creation of a life that is fulfilling, oriented to our values, and marked by service, relationships, and giving. That's what it means to have a good life. Thank you so much. Charlene?
Well, thank you, Steve. That was really wonderful. You've given us so much to think about. You know, I was thinking about my days as an early childhood teacher, which is where I started my career more than 30 years ago, and how as a young teacher, you think that you need to step in and play with the kids. But the more you do it, the more you realize that what you need to do is set the stage, give them opportunity, and then back out. Kids know how to play. Kids know how to
Sure.
play. Doesn't matter if they're 2 or 12 or 22, they all need it. So thank you for that reminder. All right, Steve, we have some great questions coming in from the audience. So let's get started. Here is a mom who asks, my teenager is a hands-on creative. She loves clay and sculpture and sewing. I'm worried that all of this screen time is depressing her creativity. Do you have any advice for us?
Reduce the screen time. That's a real dilemma, isn't it? I mean, it's a real dilemma about kids when kids are tactile and they're spending so much time sitting still, staring at a screen. I mean, you just think about what a setup that is for some kids who are kinesthetically oriented, and even in regular school in normal times, there's still movement. They still are moving from class to class and that sort of thing. No, I mean the advice I have is find ways to make that happen in the evenings, to have screen-free time. Do family stuff together where you're all sitting around in your bodies doing things, and essentially setting aside time for that, even if that means that there's some homework that's not getting done, right? And because that's essential. And the other thing I would have a real kinesthetic kid do, especially in the era of Zoom, is like here in my office, I've got like a big old bag of fidget spinners, and I just hand them out to everybody. And like having kids play with things and move their hands and move their bodies, even if they can't get up and move around. First of all, it helps with their attention, but also keeps them connected and grounded in a way that I think is real helpful.
Okay, great advice. So Steve, here's a parent who asks about, you had mentioned that public comparison can dampen creativity. She says, what about the public sharing of finished and in process artworks? This may be for a more serious art student.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of being an artist is that you have to denigrate your work, and so that's one of the things that artists learn early on. You know, that's really hard, and I think, you know, in the art students that I've worked with, they're all about butterflies about that whole thing in terms of sharing their stuff, and they will always say, well, I didn't have time to finish this, or I didn't do well at that. Everybody's going to hate it anyway. You know, but then I think also there's some pride about that too. I think any artist who is going to share their work with the world is just going to have to tolerate some anxiety on that part, right? But the unfinished piece, that part of the question, I think, is really intriguing to me. And I think any person who is really creative has to know when to take some feedback. So I think about writers who workshop their stuff and they read it out and people talk about it and critique. Sometimes you need to listen to that. And sometimes you have to say, no, everybody else is wrong about this. I got it. And that's a gut choice. That's a gut choice that I think all artists and creative people have to eventually learn how to tolerate and make some sense of.
I think that's so interesting. You know, I went back to graduate school in my 50s. You know this story. And I was so amazed at the kids, my fellow students. we're all about the rubric. And I would say, well, I'm just going to write the paper I'm going to write. And they would be like, what do you mean?
Mhm.
But that's not in the rubric. And I would say, yeah, I know. So it worried me that they were so tied to each of those points. And I like hearing that your College of Creative Studies doesn't have grades. That's really amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty great. It's pretty great. And I've had, the students who have come to class and I say, give a presentation about X, and they'll come to class and they're like, nah, here's a presentation about Y. And like, great, and everybody loves it. And so that sense of freedom, because they always do things 100%. So it's not like they're giving me a crappy presentation about why. They're into it and they're doing a great job, but it follows their passions in a way that will ultimately be more use for them than me cramming them into a box where they're giving the same presentation as everybody else.
Boy, we're getting a lot of great questions coming in, Steve. Let's keep going. How do we educate teachers, especially in the early grades, about the need for kids to move and be creative? I know you could talk about this for hours.
Yeah. So teachers know that. Teachers know that. And so I give teachers the benefit of the doubt that they know that. It's a great question. I think it's and maybe Charlene could speak to this even more, but I think being a teacher is such a hard job because you are under the umbrella of state guidelines and learning objectives and measurable this and test-based outcome that. And I think that's that I think is a real hobgoblin for being an educator in sort of modern society, is that they have to do more with less and less and less and less under time restrictions. And now they have to do it on Zoom from their living rooms. So, I think intuitively, uh, teachers know children, they understand how children work. And I think if more of them were left to their own devices, they would encourage them.
Yeah, some of the experts have been telling us, get your kid out before they sit down for Zoom. Go for a walk, take the dog out, do something before you even log in the morning. I think that's great advice. All right, Steve. So we have had digital media experts come on, and they talk a lot about the difference between passive and creative use of screens. I'm really on the fence about that advice, especially when it comes to video games. What is your thinking on this? Passive versus creative screen time?
Oy.
I know that's a tough one to ask a creative guy.
They're all terrible. No, it's um, I think it is important. I think it's a really important distinction. I think it's a really important distinction. There's one kid I work with in particular, and he's always mad at his parents because he goes to Zoom school all day, and then he wants to sit in front of his computer and write music. And his parents are saying, "No, that's all screen time." And he says, "No, it's not. It's school time, and then it's music composition time." And he's right, and so are they. It's one of these things where both things are true. And so the deal that we ended up working out is that he would do Zoom school, no computer for a couple of hours, and then he can log back in and do music and homework and other stuff. And so, but I do think there's a real big difference between using computers and using screens for creative things, for engaging things, for things that are enhancing, versus TikTok and YouTube, these things where all of a sudden kids just bolt into them, shut their minds off, and all of a sudden it's 3 hours later. And video games are a complicated discussion. We would take another like hour and a half for us to plow through. It's just, avoid the violent ones. Minecraft is probably okay. It's kind of my bottom line on that.
Okay, fair enough. Here's a question that I like. How do we spot spurts or opportunities of creativity in our children?
By really just being observant, observe, and attentive, right? So just watching very closely, and often uh, parents are parents are upset when like a kid gets really into something and then they abandon it. Like, oh, they should stick with this and do something else. I'm like, well, yeah, maybe. Like, I understand if you've invested a lot of time and energy and money and that sort of thing, and depending upon the age of the kid, of course. But I also I like the kid who samples. I like the kid who gets into a thing and then says, nah, turns out that wasn't for me. Don't want to play the violin or the ukulele or whatever. But I think it's observing and supporting without making the creative thing another task. And that's where I think a lot of people get into trouble. It's like, wow, this kid is a really interesting and talented artist. Let's get him into art classes. And yes, sometimes that's helpful if the kid wants some of that. But geez, that's another outcome-based thing that's can sometimes be even less playful. So I think there's a balance there that really has to be struck between allowing creativity to happen in its natural environment without it being a thing that then just gets scheduled.
Yeah, and I think parents have to do, first of all, do what you say, observe, and then sometimes just let your kids be. My daughter went to a name brand college, studied human biology, but she spent her middle school years sitting on my bed, chopping up Beanie Babies and making them into new animals, right? And resewing all her clothes. And today she's a senior design researcher at IDEO. So you have to have faith, I think, in your children's innate creativity, and sometimes just let them go for it.
That's right. That's right. I mean, so I think I said it in the presentation is everybody is creative. And so what we have to do is remove the barriers to creativity and just allow it to happen.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So here's a related question. Do you have any suggestions for how to create an environment at home, especially during lockdown or COVID, where we're pretty housebound?
Yeah. Yes, there's all this weird research about physical space and environment. About like, are there creative spaces? Is that a thing that exists? And it maybe the research answer on that is maybe. So good lighting is really helpful. A little messy, but not super messy, is also really helpful. Having a house plant seems to make people more creative. I think. For home offices and for home school and that sort of thing, there needs to be a space. There needs to be a space for that. That is to the extent possible, that child's space to have their stuff and the feeling of being comfortable and free and little things to do, whatever it is that's private enough, those kinds of things. I think it's giving them that space and a place for that, I think is really essential.
And that may mean that you have to get a couple of plastic boxes at Target to put everything in so they know what their stuff is. Yeah. But I agree. I think that's really important. Mm-hmm. All right, Steve, we have time for just, I think, 2 more questions. Here's a parent who just said, for my privileged kids who are stuck at home, I tell them to get tape, scissors, and a cardboard box. Good advice. Good advice. All right. This is one that I bet a lot of parents are worrying about who may have kids with learning differences. This parent writes, my 6th grade son with ASD is highly creative and artistic. He's been doing very well in school, but it takes him a long time to finish any assignment, even math problems. I hear you saying that it's good for his creativity to let him spend time on tasks, but he gets tired from working so long. How can I help him not get so stressed out as he gets older by the fact that he takes so long on his assignments? I don't want to squelch his creativity, nor do I want to hurt his chances in school.
That's a lovely question. That's a really lovely question. Because it is about the balance. And I think that one of the gifts that parents can give children is the permission and sometimes the directive to shut down, to just shut down. Like, okay, you're done with that. You've done a really marvelous and lovely job at this, but now it's time for us to shift and do something else. And certainly kids with learning differences can have school accommodations that will allow for additional time, but you're talking about the time at home. And I think that ability to know when it's good enough, that's a life skill. And certainly some kids are going to learn that skill easier than other kids. I learned good enough like way early. I was like, that's good enough. I'm going outside. Um, but sometimes that's a real challenge. I get that that's a real challenge, and that some kids, that good enough is just never going to be good enough. But I think learning that skill now is going to be really helpful in the long run. That the part of the thing that gets in the way of creativity is just hammering at it over and over again for hours and hours, right? That sometimes the thing that will actually make a better result is putting it down and then going outside and then coming back.
Really good advice. You know, one of the silver linings that we've seen, especially with teenagers during COVID, is more time. They're sleeping more. They have a little more time to just think and lie there and consider who they are. And that is a silver lining. Okay, Steve, final question. This is what I've been ending with lately because I want to honor everyone's time as well as your time tonight. Given COVID and all kind of the sobering statistics that you started with about anxiety and depression, what gives you hope for the future with our kids?
It's a lovely question. I think, historically speaking, anytime a generation goes through a hardship, it really breeds a lot of resiliency and a focus on understanding the needs of other people. And my hope for this generation of students who are, or generation of kids who are really suffering with this, and suffering with our suffering, and then suffering with the politics and the social justice issues and the prejudice that we're seeing, is I think we're actually going to have a generation of very socially minded people. That's my hope. I may be completely wrong, but that's my hope about this. That I think that COVID in particular, in the larger sociocultural setting that we find ourselves in, is going to have students who say, you know what, I want to do good in the world. I want to help people. I want to do these things because I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to make things better for people who are marginalized or disenfranchised. That's my hope.
Boy, I hope and believe that you are right, Dr. Steve Smith. I think that's a great way to end it tonight. I want to say a huge thank you to you for all of your insights. Thank you to all you parents and caregivers who attended with us. Thank you in advance to the team from the Boys and Girls Club, their students who help us prepare these videos. So again, take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay well, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much, Steve. Take care.